ahead and get started. I know we're going to have folks that are going to be joining us. I do want to be respectful of everyone's time and get the program underway this evening. First of all, I would just want to say thank you to all of you who are here. I know as the fall season descends upon us, we are all having a lot more pressures about how we spend our time, and so we are very grateful to have you all here, and thank you for continuing to support the Guild. My name is Leslie Pickle. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Managing Director of the Guild, and we have a special treat this evening. We have Thomas Dougherty joining us, who is a Guild apprentice and has some interesting things to share with us tonight on inner-block development in the American Alley. And he is actually going to be introduced by his Guild mentor, Steve Mouzon, who may also touch a little bit upon the Guild Apprentice program itself. We have some folks joining us as well, so welcome. And before we get underway, as always, I know many of us are skilled in this by now, but a little bit of housekeeping. You're welcome to turn your videos off as we get started, and of course stay muted. But then when the presentation ends, we welcome you to interact and turn your video on to ask questions and engage in the Q&A session. They tend to be quite robust and always quite the learning experience as well as the presentation. So with that, once again, welcome to everyone. And Steve Mouzon, I invite you on to the screen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. And before we get into the introduction, Gian has his hand up. And I didn't know if you wanted to see what his question was first before we get into it.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Gian? Maybe he's just high-fiving us.
Oh, okay. All right.
There we go. Okay.
No, sorry, I accidentally clicked it.
Okay, no worries. Well, I've got to say that you all are in for a tremendous treat this evening. Thomas and I have never actually even met, but we've had several long conversations on what he's going to be presenting. And it's an evolving idea that actually is really important. But I'll put it this way. It's so important to several aspects of what we do that, and will be doing in the future, I believe, that I'm not going to even say anything about his background at all, because because this idea is so important. Basically, it is kind of the idea of the inner block is sort of how places have evolved from the history of human construction, of urbanism, from, like, for example, it's how Pienza, Italy evolved from a large lot Roman subdivision of 11 1-acre lots into this fabulous UNESCO World Heritage town today that of great intensity. And as of right now, what we've done in the U.S. is we've kind of built first generation urbanism, but we haven't really had a clear path to how it can intensify and can evolve. And some of you who have heard me talk about the Sky method, this is the Sky method on steroids. And so it's something that, and I could go on for quite a while, but I would rather let the man himself actually give us his latest in what he's developing. So take it away, Thomas.
Thank you, Steve. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Let me go ahead and share my screen.
Looks perfect.
Can you see that?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to this interblock research and the focus on the alley. From 2015 to 2019, I was a grad student at Notre Dame studying architecture and urban design. And for that 2018 academic year, I was offered a year of independent research by the school and given a travel fellowship by David M. Schwartz. And I'm very grateful to both for making that possible. And I was studying primarily under Douglas Duwani, and his focus on the inner block had resonated with me prior to studying at Notre Dame, I had worked as a timber framer in Philadelphia. And I didn't make it to the city that often, to the downtown, but when I did, it were these minor streets, these inner block, they called them alleys, these residential alleys, but not alleys the way that we probably think of them now, that really captivated me. It was this 20-foot from building face to building face on this narrow residential street, and then turning on to the main street, which might be 60 or 70 feet from building face to building face. So I'd always been fascinated by these interblock streets and spaces, and the school and the fellowship made that research possible. Part of the impetus for it too was the legalization of ADUs. So I was seeing ADUs and that legislation being passed in California and Portland, spearheaded by people like Cole Peterson, and that kind of sweeping across the country and thinking about traditional cities and towns where those ADUs would be built on alleys. And I was reminded in thinking of the Philadelphia minor streets that I love so much. And so I spent that year traveling around England and the Netherlands and Belgium and East Coast colonial cities, analyzing, photographing, drawing these interblock spaces, trying to pick up, what are these best practices that could inform ADU legislation moving forward. And I published a 4-part series with Strong Towns. We've been working on it for a year, and the 4-part series, along with a bunch of analysis, got published last month at some point. And so I'm actually not going to talk about that much. I'm going to be talking about the inner block specifically, and inner block urbanism, which I haven't actually spoken about directly before. It's always been the background of what my research was, the discussions with Douglas, but tonight's presentation will be purely on inner block with a little bit of alley at the end here. And if there's a theme to tonight, it's probably this quote from Douglas Dougherty, where he writes, "Inside the city block, you find the intimacy of the hamlet, the quietness and sense of safety that can bring families with children into the city." And all this research is really a footnote. Inner block urbanism, for me, consists of a series of footnotes to Douglas. And I'm so grateful for all of his mentorship while at Notre Dame. Here is a God's house in Bruges. You can see, if you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse?
Yes.
Great. You can see it's nestled inside of this urban block here. The main streets along here. This is not a block of blocks. This is really a development inside of a block. Here's the gateway right here. This is in Bruges. And you can see the little, it's really an urban gateway, right? And the man door through that. And this is a recent trip just a month or two ago with, you can see Mike Watkins and Mickey Toledano and Scott Layton, for the first time walking into this place and experiencing the beauty of this formed urban realm here. So just to get our feet wet, I'm just going to dive on in, and I'm going to walk you through a series of inner block spaces in Utrecht, where I recently was. This is I'm gonna look at the southwest corner of the historic. This is the historic center, obviously, of Utrecht. If you're going to go as a tourist, this is where you're going to go. And I'll start here. This is the seven alleys. The 7 alleys was built between 1842 and 1860 by the local Catholic parish as working class affordable housing. You can see this is the main street here. You have the canal on your left. This is where the old city walls were, and it's now a linear park. Here are the gable ends of those 7 alleys. It's 12, my notes, 12 feet from building face to building face here. And you can see it's not a through street, right? This doesn't go through to this street over here. This actually loops around the back, and there's a series of passages that you can take between them here. This is looking down between the gable ends. And this gives you a sense on the far right-hand side, a little bit of parking, but also that it's not a through street. There's the building at the other end capping that street right there. When you step back onto the main street here and continue walking north, you see the linear park again. And we get into this little development in here. You walk down this, again, it's a 12-foot wide building face to building face. I'm going to call it inner block. We'll get into definitions a little bit later. I'm also going to use the word nested. It's inside of the block. It's not part of the main armature. You wouldn't necessarily know it's there. You have to be looking for it to some extent. As you walk down this basically affordable housing street, note too, the fronts don't start at the main street. These are all fronting the main street along here. And it's only once you get past that 30, 40-foot depth of building that you get to the minor streets that are the buildings facing the minor street here. And at this point here, you see a little lane, a narrow passage entrance. And that's another characteristic of these inner block spaces. You enter them through narrow passages. And that gets you into a shared garden courtyard. So I've just walked through this passage, and now I'm in this courtyard right here. Again, nested, right? It's completely inside of the block. And now I'm leaving it. This is the pathway back to the main street here. And this is the gateway. So again, gateway, passage, nested. These are some of the characteristics of inner block and human scaled. So now we're back on this main street here, and you walk another 30 feet or something, and you make another right. And now you're back on the narrow lanes. This is 12 foot from building face to building face. Note that the plants forming that transitional space, pull the plants away from that street, and it's lost so much of its, maybe its life, its beauty. It's these simple things when you're dealing with a 12-foot wide street, 12-foot formed space, that those plants make such a key difference. This is looking back actually toward the linear park here. On this end, there's a little covered passage, just like over here, covered passage, and you end up on the main street on the other side here, right? And now we're 24 foot from building face to building face. You can see the little curbs. There are no curbs on the minor street. And where the minor street had 1 story, a story and a half, now we're at 2 and sometimes 3 stories. So another characteristic of these interblock spaces is a transect shift, where you're going from what you could call village street to town or city street. So you can continue walking north on that street. And here's another gateway, right? Gateway into the inner block, urban gateway through the block face. And you have to walk, 40 feet, 50 feet maybe, and you're walking past the buildings, but also all of these buildings along here have courtyards, rear courtyards. So this line right here is courtyard walls. So you walk past the buildings, you walk past the courtyard walls, and now you're here. You're in this inner block park, and then you keep walking down this path, and now you're in an elementary school. And that's another thing too. Douglas would say, if you just look at a plan, a traditional plan, pre-industrial, there when there's early, I'd say a couple hundred years ago, you'll find that parochial school, you'll find these, even the parish inside of the block. And so the rest of the presentation, it's going to be in some ways answering these 3 questions. Is there a working definition for inner block? What are its characteristics? And does whatever definition we come up with during this talk this evening have significance for American towns and cities that are laid out on a grid, not an organic plan like this? But instead of answering these questions, I'm going to look at a few other things. So is the inner block a fundamental building block of urban design? This is Stephen Peterson's diagrams from Space and Anti-Space. And he's looking at Rome. This is the Aventine Hill. So he starts with a variety of block shapes. and that those block shapes start to make sense as they form the urban fabric. But those blocks then, the underlying framework or component of the block shape is the block unit. And the block unit only makes sense when you understand the inner block. So these are all given form, all the variety of block shapes are given form by the inner block courtyard, which then leads to the block units forming a block, and then the urban fabric itself. And that makes sense when I look at the Rome, the Noli plan of Rome, and I can see, you know, the organic blocks. I can see this is Bramante's courtyard, you know, Santa Maria della Pace, Piazza Navona, it's right here, you can't really see it. But I can see the church itself is kind of like a, you know, it's the internal regular shape that's giving form to that block component. Here, the courtyard is doing the same thing. Well, that breaks down, and not that Stephen Peterson meant that it necessarily carried over, but it doesn't really carry over to these minor streets or alleys in Philadelphia or the garden courtyards of Bruges. And so this is a figure ground of a minor street in Philadelphia. Note, like Utrecht, when you walk down it, you're actually walking down the sides of buildings until you get, you know, whatever it is, 45, 50 feet in. And that's when the minor street starts to be shaped by these Trinity party wall townhouses here. Or the garden courtyard here, you know, clearly it's a shared garden courtyard. In some sense, I see Stephen Peterson's argument, but it's not really defining a block component. There's not a regularity that, you know, this courtyard itself is shaped by the irregularity of this organic block. And this is a really important point. And this history is told very well by this book, North Atlantic Cities, that was just recently published by Charles Duff. And this is a quote from Witold Rubczynski, which I'm going to read. The smallest unit of American urban development was the individual house rather than the palazzo or courtyard apartment. This continued the building tradition of the English and the Dutch, which faced the street with the entrance to the house as opposed to an entrance off a courtyard. This prompted the development of the quiet, semi-private residential street where some of the privacy of the courtyard was created. And I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind when you study the urbanism of Mediterranean Europe or of, you know, of Paris or Vienna or these other cities which are composed of palazzos and courtyard apartments, that there's a lot to be learned from that, but the American street can only really be understood when you understand the Dutch and the English tradition, which we inherited with that front door, which opens directly onto the street. And so this is a minor street in Philadelphia, and you can see aspects of that courtyard, you know, this transitional, this necessary and important transitional space, this quietness of the street, you know, that we see characteristics of the courtyard here on either side. And so rather than the palazzo courtyard here, this element is now ending up on the minor streets here. And so these are my questions, but as I said, as opposed to answering those questions, I'm going to make the case that an inner block street of Bremen, Germany is like an Apple store. And I live close to King of Prussia is fairly close to me. And I think Douglas would often look at mall layouts to talk about anchor sites, spaces between centers. And so looking at the King of Prussia Mall, we can see, okay, where are the anchor stores and where is the fabric in between? And you can see some similarities, you know, okay, here's the anchor site of the historic center of Bremen. Again, you know, the layout is clear to architects and urban designers. Douglas would want you to, you know, pace this out and see how the people that were laying out these malls actually knew a whole lot about people's attention span and getting from store to store. What they didn't know when they laid this out was that Apple Store was coming later on, the iPhone was coming. And so the true anchor store, one of the most significant anchor stores, actually has less real estate than Gap Kids here. And so Bremen, Germany, zooming back out as an urban designer, you guys are looking at the screen, you can see where the historic center is. You can see where tourists want to go. And I don't use that disparagingly. I think if Steve moves on, what's the, how do we measure the greatness of architecture? It's the places that move us the most, move people the most. And so, if this is the popular place to go, if this is the tourist place to go, let's pay attention. What do people love about that? So obviously this is the historic center. You can see that, you can see the old walls, you can see the organic form. Probably this at one point was historic. I'm sure that was important. The three bridges are probably three historic points, even if they're modern bridges today. This, I'm assuming, is post-war development, or at least largely that. So here's the figured ground of Bremen. And again, as designers, we can kind of look, I don't want to go up here, I can see that. This is all modern, this looks blown out. These streets actually don't look so great either. It looks like this might have been hurt during the war, I don't know. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was bombed. But you can kind of see down here, okay, this looks like the heart of it. It would make sense given this shape here. And yes, these are the main, the market hall, the main cathedral, the market, I guess this is market plots and town hall probably. But that's not actually why I picked Bremen or started looking at Bremen a while ago. I was following on social media European like travel posts, like Instagram things that would travel around Europe and post beautiful pictures. And I kept seeing Bremen come up. And so I assumed that Bremen was, like Bruges, had these medieval streets that had been somehow preserved, and it was going to be, a beautiful place to go visit to study minor streets. And then I started noting that all the pictures were showing the same building. So these are the top pictures. If you just search Bremen on Instagram, these are, in the top 10 pictures, and 3 of these are showing the same building. And I'm pretty sure this space is this space in reverse. So that's when I started looking into Bremen and realized that the anchor store, the anchor urbanism, what brings people to Bremen is this tiny little fragment of medieval urbanism, this medieval street, which was originally a fisherman's street, right next to the water here. Was the name has something to do with fishermen's houses along it. I wrote a quarter here, but it's just a street. It's composed of 111 historic buildings, and it's the last medieval fragment of Bremen, Germany. And it's also the most popular tourist attraction for, the 11th largest, Bremen's the 11th largest city in Germany. And just to get a little scale reference, this is an aerial of a satellite view of that street, right? This is the main pole of Bremen, Germany. That fits inside of, I drew I think it's a 330 by 660 residential, that's centerline, residential block of my town here in Westchester, PA. And this right here, this kind of Apple Store anchor of Bremen could be built by Clay Chapman or Austin Tunnel in their sleep. And so, how are Apple stores and Innerblock space? Apple stores and Innerblock spaces can be anchor stores or places with very little real estate. So here you can see Apple, in this kind of little forgotten corner that's smaller than the Gap Kids store, is one of the true anchor stores of King of Prussia Mall. And same with this little fragment of medieval urbanism here. So I'm calling it Innerblock, but why am I calling it Innerblock? Maybe we should be calling this many blocks. Is this, you could argue maybe that this is a block. Is that a block? If that, just accept that as a street, then here's a block, here's a block. And this is a quote from Leon Creer. My main affirmation as regards urban design would be urban blocks should be as small in length and width as typologically viable. They should form as many well-defined streets and squares as possible in the form of a multi-directional horizontal pattern of urban spaces. So make small blocks. But I think if we only understand it as small blocks, we're going to lose some of the characteristics of Innerblock, which I'm going to make an argument that this street has, And so we really need to understand it more as this nested place, this inner block place. So what allows this street to be the anchor urban place of Bremen? And I would say here are some characteristics. Interblock urbanism, it's nested, and it's off the main armature, and it really could be anywhere. Because it's such a formed place, it's not reliant on the rest of the town. When you're on this street, when you can bring that scale down, this really could be inside of my residential block of my hometown. And because of that, it has this capacity to give us a formed urban realm at a human scale, which is not found anywhere else in these small blocks. Another characteristic of inner block is that transect shift. It's that I'm going from city, which Bremen really is. You know, these are all, you can't tell from this image, but these are all tall buildings. These are all city buildings. And then when you get on the street, it really is a town or village street to some extent. And then also that human scale. If all we're understanding this is a block of blocks, we lose the fact that when you come across nested urbanism tends to be at least at a human scale, and human scale is ambiguous, but I think there's even some value to that ambiguity and say, well, I recognize that human scale when I see it. And especially when we think of pedestrian scale, right? And the pedestrian has, it's more than simply the time to get from point A to point B. It's also that scale that I experience with my, cone of vision, at the speed, 3 miles per hour, whatever walking speed is, that this urbanism reflects that in a way that none of this urbanism does. And I want to bring us back to this starting image too, because this is clearly not a block of blocks, right? This is clearly inner block, and it also has those characteristics. It's nested, there's the transect shift, there's the human scale. And getting us back to that quote from Douglas, there's an intimacy, there's a sense of Hamlet that's possible that can bring families and children in the city. Not that that's the goal, that's not what I mean, but when you experience it, you realize it. So nested, I wanted to just show this image of Circus Lane, because this is another inner block street, which I think it becomes clear that it is not 2 blocks, right? This width, it's all context. If the whole city of Edinburgh, this is Newtown, Edinburgh, it wouldn't be, but if the whole city were these minor medieval street scaled places, I wouldn't say it was nested necessarily. But the context of Circus Lane here, next to all these very wide, there's a park here, next to all these very wide streets and the park, make it clear that it's nested inside of this. This is not 2 blocks, but 1 block. And this series of images shows that. Here's the first one. I'm standing here. You can see it's it's 75 to 95 feet cornice height of these main city buildings, and 100 feet from building face to building face. And then I get to about right there. This is image number 2, and I turn to the left. And it's almost startling when you look down and you see this other world that's so close to this Newtown, Edinburgh, Enlightenment city planning world. And here is a village. You take, another, 20-second walk down the street, and you're now 18 to 22 foot cornice height and 18 feet from building face to building face. So nested urbanism and defining place. There's a famous saying, there are 3 things that matter in property: location, location, location. One of those aspects of location, or an aspect of location to our experience, at least of location, if I remember a place for its locale, if it's memorable, period, that it is memorable, there has to be a sense of place. This is from the lexicon: a highly desirable but elusive attribute of urbanism. Its existence is notoriously unpredictable in conventional suburban design, but common in traditional urban fabric. This is Peruvian Ave and Worth Ave in Palm Beach, Florida. It's the most expensive, most valuable retail real estate in Palm Beach. And it doesn't, where is that? that, that's not it, right? It's right there. There's that location. This is Via Meisner, built in 1923 by the architect Addison Meisner. And we start to see those attributes again, right? It's nested inside the block. There's a clear transect shift where you go from that, this is the context. This is inside the block, right there, here. Look at that sense of place. Look at that human scale. And I want to put it, human scale spaces like these define a place, even if they account for a very little part of the overall square footage or cost. And that's the whole point with the Apple Store too. The Apple Store I think it grosses, something like 6,000 per square foot, which is 3 or 4 times what the next best retail, store in King of Prussia or any mall makes. And part of that is its ability to, it doesn't need a huge amount of real estate. It can define, it's valuable at that small setting. And in some sense, you can define place much more easily at this small scale. And I'm not really comparing, I don't mean to judge one, I don't mean to judge one by looking at the other. This is, Via Meisner. This is, I can't remember where, I'm sorry. It could have been one of yours. This is, an urban design public square. And I just want to point out the capital and land required to define location and sense of place in each. It's exponentially different. The amount of money on the left, the amount of land on the left, and the amount of land and money on the right. And they're not really comparable, and they're both really valuable, but we need to recognize that interblock space for what it is and the potential to create that anchor urbanism that little street does in Bremen, for what it is. Here's a modern example. Vitold just wrote his new book, Charleston Fancy, on this development. This is urban ergonomics in Charleston. This is an interblock, space, leftover space. This is, only incremental developers could love or ever want this space. And yet, look at what they've done with a handful of buildings. They've started to define this lane that goes around here. And this is the kind of place, these are the kind of places, these formed urban spaces that they were able to create. Look at the human scale that they've gotten down to right here. The details on this archway, the lack of curbs, the human, so nested, transect shift, human scale that they've achieved here. And this is the context, right? And this is, the ever-present American street context, and not even to diminish it, I might argue that Catfiddle Street can't even really operate publicly. If it were all Catfiddle streets, we couldn't get our modern infrastructure in there, maybe. But because we have this American street as its neighbor, we can develop this interblock Catfiddle Street right next to it. Opticos Design did something similar in Daybreak Muse in Utah. Is this 2 blocks or is this 8 blocks? And I think when we start to think about, okay, well, there are those characteristics, that nested sense, that transect shift here, that human scale that they've been able to create here. I think it's valuable to call it interblock. It's valuable to recognize this space is carved out from inside the block. Here's another alley which services all of these. At a presentation Dan gave of this, I think I remember him saying that the developer was nervous about this move, about this design move. But in the end, I think they're calling them Muse houses, Muse houses. They ended up selling more quickly than these outer houses. These were more desirable, definitely per square foot than the rest of the development. And the pocket neighborhoods, Ross, Chapin, and the others. This is another example of building inside the block of modern residential development, designing, forming both sides, all sides of the development. And because of that, being able to create this sense of place, which is so key to that sense of location. I don't know what the rest of the the land values are for right here, but I could imagine them being quite low. But as a developer, if you can develop your own location, if you can create your own location, in some sense, you can create your own land values. And Innerblock gives you an opportunity to do that. This is a project that I'm working on with Grant Humphreys in Carlson Landing. This is inspired by the God's House. You can see the God's House on the right, and the design hurdle is how do we bring that God's House into the 21st century? I just have a few slides on it, but we look at what are the key characteristics of the God's House that we need to bring. What are these key characteristics of Innerblock space that we bring into the 21st century, bring to Carlton Landing, which is obviously not Bruges, it's not these party walls. So there's the garden courtyard. There's that urban gateway that we were seeing in Utrecht and Bruges. There's the party wall masonry here. And so we have 16 units. This is inside of a residential block to be built. We have one opening here so that we can control how one enters in, and then we'll have walls on either side of this lane, controlling that space as we move through the block from left to right. And some of the inspiration for the courtyard there and how it nestles inside of the block. And at the risk of derailing this presentation, I'm going to briefly touch on some research I did with Douglas back in 2019 on settlement types in Britain, the transect, and the scale of the neighborhood unit. So refining the transect via study of settlement types, nesting, settlement components being nested one inside of another, and then the human scale that is evident in pre-industrial villages, towns, and cities. And the kind of thesis of this is that the pre-industrial settlement types had patterns of scale, hamlet, village, town, city, and that those settlements are composed of discrete wholes. And so you can think of, the Pantheon with its temple, its triumphant arch, its tholos, all coming together to make up the Pantheon as a composition, and that we can't understand these villages, towns, and cities without understanding the components that made those places up and how those then get reinterpreted and nested one inside of another. And so very briefly, I'm going to go through a little bit of that research I did with Douglas. So this is the English village. They're made up of a series of components. This is a furlong, 660 feet. And so this is, diameter, and then radius, 1/8 of a mile, which is significant when you think about neighborhood unit and some other things. But you can see that the center of that pre-industrial traditional village is the village green. The church on one side, another street going off here. It's an agricultural settlement type unit. And so there is almost no economy to it at this point. But some of those villages became market towns. And what you see that the original village green, let's say that was the village green, now that's a market square. And the village green extended, maybe it was developed and extended down. And this little spina, this spine, that's what happens when the market halls, these tents become a little bit more stable. They start out as tents, let's say, and you slowly develop this little string of market. And you'll see that in, all the traditional historic centers, or many of them, that in the market plots will be these buildings that are market buildings that were later developed. So these are components, right, of the market town. And again, sorry, these are English settlement types. I'm not claiming to have studied all, but English settlement types, where we have the market square, market street, we have the guild hall, we have the spina of market buildings. We now have a couple chapels, a school, and here's the village street has come back, right? The residential street has come back and is now developed up here. That then sometimes became a city, and you can see these same components, right? Where the market square of the city, well, it's a little bit more refined. There's probably 4 stories as opposed to 3, or 3 stories as opposed to 2, but it's still a component of the market town. The city is developed out. There's many more of these village streets around here, and some of these other components that are found inside, you know, the hamlet. We can now find little nested hamlets. I can't necessarily point out one here on this figure ground, but I'm sure that there are little developments inside of these blocks. And these are these scales that we talked about. The hamlet is the furlong 660 diameter. The village has 2 of those, right? That usually comes up with the village street, and the village was that. It's a street. It's buildings on either side of a village green. The market town, now it's fairly linear usually, but now we're at that quarter-mile radius, which we remember from Clarence Perry and the neighborhood unit and the Transect, and how that's been the quarter, how that's been used over and over. And then Cathedral City is also pretty much within that framework as well. And what it's reflecting is obviously economics and the pedestrian, right? If there is no economics other than agriculture, the village can only build so far. When you get the economics of the market town, you can build some more. When you become a cathedral city, obviously there's even more. This is a quote from Lewis Mumford. And this is a critique in some sense of the neighborhood unit. In a rudimentary form, neighborhoods exist as a fact of nature, whether or not we recognize them or provide for their particular functions. For neighbors are people who simply live near one another. To share the same place is perhaps the most primitive of social bonds, and to be within view of one's neighbors is the simplest form of association. I'm not trying to redefine neighborhood, but I do want to think about the way we use these words. And as urban designers, we're often talking about, the 10-minute walk, the quarter-mile radius. And we often, I think, call that neighborhood. And I think it's important to think about, what do we think when we hear the word neighborhood? This quote from Lewis Mumford, and then these are kind of CNU building blocks. The neighborhood is a comprehensive planning increment. When clustered with others, it becomes a town. When standing free in the landscape, it becomes a village, right? This is the neighborhood. The neighborhood varies in population and density to accommodate localized conditions, limited in size, 5-minute walk. So that's, this is Poundbury. This is Leon Curry's Poundbury. And these circles, I'm gonna use the same color. So this is 660, this is a furlong. Here we have the nested hamlet. Nested hamlet, nested hamlet. You can see the way that he's building his blocks, his block components, and the scale that he's using. Here is that village dimension that we talked about. This is the furlong radius from here to here. This is 1/8 of a mile. And this is Poundbury as a whole. And you can see this little section right here, which Leon calls a quarter. This is that village scale, village streets here, 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 here. And then it's, that neighborhood scale that we talk about here, here, that's all of Poundbury. And so the transect, is this a gradient of characteristics? This is, I'm attributing this to Andreas, but I'm pretty sure this shows up also in the lexicon. The 6 habitats vary by level and intensity of their physical and social character. Is this, just levels of intensity, or is the neighborhood, is the city, is the quarter composed of discrete wholes as we see here? And again, our diagrams of the transect lead me, and I think others, to think of the transect as this gradation. A delineation of characteristics, and it's not described as discrete wholes. Whereas this diagram on the bottom, this is delineation of block size from Leon. He says this illustration clearly shows that hypothesis that in urban centers, the blocks are small since they grow larger towards the periphery, where they often contain large gardens and fields. And of course, those large gardens and fields would be inner block out here. But you maintain this urban form throughout. And all of these blocks then are riddled with inner block spaces, inner block village streets. So to get back to that question, is there a working definition for inner block? What are its characteristics? And how does that inform American towns and cities laid out on a grid? I want to go back to the Dutch and English tradition of nested urbanism here. And I guess I would answer the first two questions. I would answer, is there a working definition for inner block? Well, probably its characteristics. That's the only definition I can really come up with. And those characteristics that are definitive of the Dutch and English tradition. So again, kind of the theme inside the city block, you find the intimacy of the hamlet, the quietness and sense of safety that can bring families with children into the city. Bruges, Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the form, the urban form of these inner blocks really is inherited directly from London in the rebuilding of London after the Great Fire in 1666. And those characteristics then are nested, it's inside the block, it's off the main armature. There's that transect shift where you go from, typically you go from city to town, town to village, city to village, you go down, but as the Charleston example gave us, you leave the American street context to go into something much more defined and city-like, so the transect shift could go the other way as well. And also that human scale that you find inside of the block. And the last question of, does this definition, what significance does it have for American towns and cities? I'm going to answer with some information on the American Alley and some of the stuff that I published with Strong Towns recently. So I'm going to talk about two different urban types, alley and minor street. These two blocks are drawn at the same scale. And so it's remarkable to see this very highly urban form, this Panama Street or alley in Philadelphia, at the same scale as the alley in Westchester, PA, and think about the potential of one and the other. So why alleys, why now? Well, one of them is land. Alleys and rear yards make up huge amounts of land in American cities. In Chicago alone, there are 1,900 miles of alleys. That's long enough to stretch from Chicago to Los Angeles. So the vast amount of real estate that is sitting inside of American cities today, traditional American cities. The second one is ADUs, and the new ADU legislation sweeping across the country, which is really allowing for the development along alleys for the first time in a century. And the final one, that forgotten human scale. And I would argue that there's a human scale that has really been forgotten in America. And for almost all cities and towns in America, it really never existed, but we can find it in the alley. We can find the remnants of it. We can find that 20 foot from building face to building face, or just from outside to outside of alley there. So briefly, the history of these two different urban street types. English colonial towns didn't have alleys. They were developed informally without a master plan. So you can see Boston on the left. These are all at the same scale. Developed organically, famously was said to have paved cow paths. You have Cambridge, which is roughly orthogonal, but you can see there are no inner block streets, there are no inner block alleys, and Providence the same. There were no alleys at this point. This is 1630. Philadelphia in 1682. This is the first formally planned, large planned city in the United States. And William Penn writes, "Let every house be placed, if the person pleases, in the middle of its plan, that it may be a green country town which will never be burnt and always be wholesome." So already at the beginning, you have the founder suggesting pulling your buildings away from the street. So, reducing any kind of urban form that you might have. And also not dense at all. But that's not actually how Philadelphia developed. In Philadelphia in 1702, just a handful of years later, you see it's developed along the wharf because that was the economic hub. And all of these red streets here are all these unplanned minor streets that were developed by incremental developers. So our definition here is a pedestrian scaled, inner block, nested street formed by buildings and walls which front the street. And so these are the planned streets on the left. And on the right, you have the unplanned streets and more unplanned minor streets of Philadelphia. And this is a typical 400 by 400 Philadelphia block. You can see how it's been split up, right? You know, is it, and again, we get this question of, is this one block? Is this 4 blocks? But if you think about, you know, that human scale, that transect shift, that sense of being nested, I would like to argue that this is inner block and there's value to calling it that. These are these narrow minor streets formed by Trinity houses. These are 3-story little party wall row houses all along them. Between 1840 and 1850, the population of Philadelphia grew by 60%. Much of that growth happened inside of the block. And social activists at the time started to take note of the poverty of the unsanitary conditions found there. In 1904, Emily Den Whittle wrote, "I thought Philadelphia had no bad conditions, that it was a city of homes, yet the intricate network of courts and alleys with which the interior of the blocks are covered is a conspicuous feature." At about 1900, they stopped developing alleys. It started to become illegal, both from a building code point of view and from a zoning point of view, both in Philadelphia and around all of the East Coast, where, you know, I'm talking about these minor streets in Philly, but it was something that was prevalent in Boston and Baltimore and many other cities. So the history of the service alley in America, which is different. For that, you really have to go back to London and the Great Fire of London. And my definition right now is the American service alley is a common right-of-way that borders the backs of urban property lots. Alleys are traditionally the home of services such as trash collection for the buildings that front the major street and are by their nature backs, not fronts. This is Grosvenor Square in 1721. You can see the mews running down the center of these, and these are really, you know, lined by carriage houses. These are interblock streets, service streets, specifically built for carriage houses. The same people that are developing west of London after the Great Fire are also developing in the New World. And so you have those same speculators having Oglethorpe lay out Savannah in 1733. And when he does so, he brings the Mews, or at that point, what it was called the Lane, to Savannah. And that's the first time we get the service alley in the United States. So for about 100 years, the service alley stays in Georgia. It stays in the Georgia colony and doesn't make its way out. But by about 1800, 1810, 1820, people are crossing the Ohio River. The continental grid is, you know, the basis for now platting all of these Midwest towns, and Chicago kind of, you know, sets the stage for developing with alleys. When it's laid out in 1830, it has 58 blocks. The streets are 66 foot wide, and each block has an alley that's 16 foot wide. And at that time, they're no longer service carriage streets for the wealthy. These are now the service streets for the industrial city. So coal delivery, latrines with that night soil removal, water wells, kitchens, stables. This is the service alley that if you have one in your hometown, that's its history.
Thomas, pardon the interruption. This is Leslie. We have about 5 more minutes. I just wanted to give you a heads up before we start Q&A. Thank you.
So the American alley in the industrial city soon became the home to the poorest in the communities. And again, leaders became aware, and they started to crack down. DC famously had, I think Congress put together a group to make illegal all living in DC alleys. They were already on the way out though. Riverside, laid out by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1869, kind of spelled the end of it. You see the City Beautiful planning here the flowing streets, there are no alleys in sight. The alleys were the worst of the industrial city. And with infrastructural innovations, they were aware they would be left behind. The City Club of Chicago had a competition in 1913, which even more so, conspicuously has almost no alleys and really leads the new development of the 20th century, pushing forward without the service alley. So now the infrastructure, which was the impetus for the alley, if you have one in your town, coal delivery, latrines, night soil removal, water wells, kitchens, this fits within your cavity wall. And today, that infrastructure, city plumbing, on-street parking, emergency vehicles, those are primarily on the main street. And in many cities across the country, alleys are being deplatted or just simply abandoned, not kept up. And it is a hidden resource that is not being utilized at all. And we need to recognize that before it gets deplatted. So let's build ADUs along alleys, right? So the vision is the Utrecht Street. The reality is some of these ADUs going up today. And so I'm going to lay out quickly, maybe some guidelines for what can homeowners do to try to capture some of these characteristics of urban, of interblock development. The first one I would recommend is an alley form-based code, which could go hand in hand with new ADU legislation. And thus, when you legalize ADUs, those are built in such a manner as to form that minor street, as to create that 20-foot wide, street, similar to what we saw in Utrecht, even at a much lower density, if you're incorporating, components like street walls and other things like that, you'll be able to form that space. And so here's a series of drawings. This is the blank canvas of the alley. Our precedent, the Mews in London on the left, this is a beautiful residential street, even though it wasn't, developed as a residential street. Why? Well, because it's a formed urban space. And our modern ADUs don't even have a sensibility to form space. They're designed to be anywhere. This is an advertisement for one on the right. So buildings need to be placed to form that space. But unless everybody on your block is going to build an ADU, we need other tools in our toolkit. On the right, you can see the perspective. It's still not a formed space. So we can bring into play walls. Walls are common throughout the interblock spaces of England and the Netherlands. And so just adding the walls, right? This was our space. This is our space with walls and trees, an outbuilding. And you start to get that sense of spatial enclosure that defines space, which is so key to defining location. And here we've also created that human scale. So as ADU legislation unlocks real estate along alleys for the first time in a century, it's time that we recognize the potential for spatially formed, human-scaled, beautiful and prosperous urban places already lies within every urban block. And Leslie, this is my last image. I think this is actually a really interesting one, a really valuable one. Obviously, Florence on the bottom left. There's no accurate reconstruction of Florence that I could find. So that's the quarter of Timgad above. But the scale is very similar. The remnants of Florence I could find were very much like that. So 59 BC, this is laid out, the origin of Florence is laid out by Julius Caesar. You can see the Cardo and the Decumanus that you can still see in Florence today. So 1,500 years, how do we humanize this grid? You have the fall of Rome, almost, continuous war, famine, abandonment at one point, the Renaissance, the rebirth, and in 1436 AD, the Duomo is finished. On the right, these are 4 blocks from my hometown in Westchester today. This is 2021. And my point here is that we have developed so little. And so, the density that was present here, in some ways, to get to here, it needed demolition at a large scale. This is hardly built. This is at the same scale This is our, little medieval street from Bremen. This is ADUs and alley development, allowing for unlimited alley development, let's say along here. And this would be alleys and or ADU development at, one ADU per lot. But we have the potential to bring that nested urbanism, the human scale, to our, towns and cities for the first time really in American history by recognizing the potential of the inner block. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. We'll give you a moment to catch your breath. Thank you so much. Our fearless leader, Nathan Norris, has had his hand up for a little while, but I did not want to interrupt you, but I will hand it off to you, Nathan, for the first question. Thank you.
Great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, the two things for Thomas. First of all, it is a high five as well as a question. And the question will come last. I did want to make a few comments. It's the tradition that's albeit a young one, but it's something that we believe in is to try to critique different things. And so I want to throw a couple different ideas out there for your consideration as you move forward. I thought the notion of the Transect Shift was interesting. Historically, Andreas would explain what the ideal scenario has always been in real estate, certainly in the United States and probably beyond. And that's the combination of town and country.
Yeah.
So when you look at those very urban city centers in Europe, if there's any amount of nature in a small court embedded in the inner block, that's obviously going to be of great interest and is likely to be very loved, and there's going to be an undersupply of it. But I've always found it easy to understand the lure of bungalow courts and cottage courts and other things. Is it's like almost a little oasis that provides you that. I'd never heard the term transect shift, but that's essentially town and country to me. The second issue had to do with the notion of nesting. Is that the key to, when you're doing, like your project in Carlton Landing, one of the cool things about that is just you're trying to add variety. If you had these absolutely everywhere, like a cottage court everywhere, it wouldn't be very cool. Or if you had that street in Bremen, if that were on every block, it wouldn't be nearly as cool. And so the notion of building in variety of different blocks is something that, I live in the neighborhood Steve Muzan designed, and he did a great job of looking at creating that variety. And so this is one of those things that you may want to tell people when you're talking about it, that you don't want to do it everywhere, but it adds great character to an overall place. Essentially, it becomes an amenity. If I could walk to that street in Bremen in my neighborhood, wouldn't that be a cool thing? But I wouldn't want to walk in it everywhere. The other thing is I really was intrigued by what you were designing at Carlton Landing. One of the most fascinating things about design is talking about why it isn't designed in a certain way. So that's sort of that would be a great discussion point. We could have spent probably 20 minutes talking about the different things, because when you start talking about this inner block design, you're immediately talking about compromises. We are going to compromise in some way to get this other element, and so where do you draw that line? If I don't have the rear service lane, that's going to create some trouble. So, we already know what happens when we don't have rear lanes. It makes services a little more difficult. But if you can be compensated for that, I think that's kind of cool. The final thing that I really wanted to talk about, this essentially, most of your images are illegal to build in the United States. And so you're building upon a movement that essentially is just starting to legalize these conditions. One of the reasons why they're illegal in a lot of places is because there weren't the tools to manage living on the alleys well. Meaning that, as we have homeowners associations and new developments, and those actually can allow these alleys to happen and function well because of the management. In older neighborhoods, it's tough to retrofit management that might control issues having to do with nuisances like noise, not keeping things up, even crime to an extent. So that management component can make it work and needs to make it work so that it can be more politically palatable to adopt these codes that will make these conditions more common. The second element to making them more common beyond articulating how you manage these existing infill locations is also on the design front. As we know, Americans have an aversion to density when it's poorly designed, but they will gravitate toward density that's beautifully designed. And so I think those are the management and the design are two elements that are worthy of your discussion, because if you're an audience talking about this, even if they're not going to tell you, those oftentimes are going to be some of their concerns. So anyhow, good presentation. I really love the historical analysis that you gave, but I look forward to your next presentation as well.
Thanks, Nathan. And I actually want to just comment on one of those things with this. Can you see? No, you can't see my screen quite yet. I'm going back to this image, right? What are you seeing? Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. That concept of interest, that concept of alteration, you started with the Transect Shift. That's a great point. And one of the things I want to say as well that the Innerblock gives us, which I mentioned with that Charleston one, is that, like you said, you can't build like this. And an argument could be made that we shouldn't be looking at medieval urbanism. We shouldn't be looking at these traditional cities because they're not reflecting the needs of the present day. One of the beauties of turning our urbanism inside out, turning our existing cities inside out. This is our city. I actually live in a dense town, relatively dense town. Look at, obviously, all the, I had to draw in faintly the curb cuts just so that it could make sense. We have the ability to build medieval urbanism, which, yes, is currently illegal, but could be serviced. You could have a trash container somewhere around here. You could service this beautiful nested place, which I could be in Bremen walking down it, or I could be in my backyard. And it really doesn't, you can talk about appropriateness, but as far as the experience of locale, I'm only reliant on either side of that street because I brought that scale down. And as you talked about, management and development, and that's a great point. And I didn't bring it up, obviously, different ways of how do we tackle the inner block? And I showed residential blocks, but it could be any number. This obviously would have to be some sort of fee simple splitting the block in half, which I know the Atlanta group, Atlanta ADU with, what's his name? He's working on, fee simple splitting off the backs. But this could be some version of combination of, I buy up 4 lots here, I develop a little street here, ADUs along here, or simply ADUs along here, developed in such a way as to take advantage of that nested space for that transect shift. But thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Gary Brewer had a question?
Great presentation. It was interesting to see all of the drawings. What seemed to be notably absent from the drawings and even the conversation is the issue of the car. And, when you're looking at sort of 19th century examples where they don't have to address the issue of the car and the pedestrian, it's a little sort of, you kind of have to come to the conclusion, well, how relevant are they really for today? And what seemed to be missing is American architects from the 1880s to the 1940s with the American garden suburb movement, is that they were looking at precedents like you were showing that didn't deal with the car, but they were trying to deal with the car. And in your presentation, you kind of implied that at the end of Riverside and the planning of Riverside, that there wasn't much interest in alleys. But actually, in reality, from the 1880s to the 1930s, there was great interest in alleys with American architects and planners. And they also tried to deal with, how do you deal with parking and how do you deal with separating parking from the pedestrian? So I would encourage you to kind of take your train of thought and continue down that line where you modify your presentation, where you start to really look at the generation of American architects that looked at the precedents that you were identifying and tried to figure out how to modernize them. Because that's the great thing about American architects. There is a tendency, and I know Notre Dame quite well, there is a tendency to kind of look at only European precedents as opposed to looking at American precedents. But America from the 1870s to 1940s, not only in urban planning and in alleys, but even in all other building types, the great contribution was taking traditional architecture and melding it with the sort of differences of modern living. And last point is, I would encourage you in looking and doing your studies, you might take a look at, I guess I have to make a plug for Bob Stern, but Paradise Planned, which sort of covers the American garden suburb from the 1880s to the 1940s, as well as European precedents, and touches on alleys as well. So that was my only comment, but in general, I thought that the entire presentation was excellent, and maybe you could talk to the issue of the car.
Thanks, Gary. On that note, and I appreciate all those comments, I was under the impression, I gave Riverside as kind of like a precursor example. Most of those alleys stopped being built at about 1920, mid-1920s. And it really was infrastructural innovations, including the automobile, that pushed that. I don't doubt that they were trying to incorporate the car, but I also think that it's a disservice to, let's say, incremental developers and others to necessarily tie one's hand, and I would say tie, by taking for granted, that car has to be there. American demographics are changing. Housing needs are changing. Elderly are looking for options other than the institutional, options that we have today. And the development in Carlton Landing, for example, is designed as elderly housing. There will be some parking that will be adjacent, but I do think that, this research was really meant for the kind of strong towns, incremental developers, something to go hand in hand with ADU policies. And one of the key, legislation pieces that ARP and some of these others are voicing, they're saying this needs to go with ADU policy that works, is no parking requirements. So I do think it's important, yes, engage, Innerblock with parking and those needs. You can see any of my examples that have gone into the 21st century, parking is somewhere. Like the Philadelphia alleys, these minor streets, they have no parking, and they are some of the hottest real estate of that area, but parking is somewhere. So somebody has to think about it at some point. But on the other hand, maybe proximate parking, I think that incremental developers, small urban designers like myself, should feel free to distance the parking somewhat.
If you want what you're proposing to be adopted by most people today who consider, and this includes developers, that parking is a reality, an argument that these are really wonderful things without parking, kind of falls on deaf ears. And Cat Fiddle Alley in Charleston, which I've been to, it works because it does have parking. And,
parking is an attribute even.
Yeah, and there were examples past the 1920s where town planners tried to deal with alleys and with parking. One perhaps bad example is Radford, where Radford had alleys facing the fronts of the houses, and it put garages in the back. And you know what? Nobody used the alleys. The front doors to every single one of those houses became the back where the car was. So it's a balance between being optimistic that the future is going to change, but also being realistic that what you're dealing with today does include the car. And your kind of presentation, if you're trying to pitch it to developers and to people within the community, is to try to sort of say, how can you have both? Because I think that that is how you potentially convince people. And from 1880, all the way through new urbanism, there's plenty of examples of how alleys and cars work together. And it isn't just about here's the width of the alley and here's the height of the buildings that face it. That kind of presentation gets into the nitty-gritty of how do you park a car. So I just think that your presentation is excellent, and it would be even better if it more realistically addressed the car.
Yeah. Say something, Clay.
How's it going?
Good.
Hey, love your presentation. I've got some friends of yours here.
Yeah, it's good to see them.
Hey, I'm in. I really, it's not a hard sell for me, obviously, but I think that there's definitely a shift in what people are gravitating to, and they're definitely moving more and more away from cars. I know a number of young people that aren't even bothering to get their driver's license. So the change is happening. It happens slowly, but I think Gary's right. Figure out a way to accomplish both things for now, and we begin transitioning a little further and further away from the absolute importance of parking. It is important. I'm not saying that it's not important, but clearly it doesn't have to be the most important thing. Yeah, really, really fascinating presentation. When you were showing your, I think it was your 2030 block with the Bremen kind of superimposed on, was that the actual scale of?
Yeah.
That's incredible. So
it's incredible, and if you think about it as that anchor store, and that's one of the things I remember in an NTBA presentation, I'm talking about the Apple Store and the significance of it being able to bring in that $6,000 per square foot. If you think about it as that anchor urbanism for Bremen, people are coming to that city for that moment, right? And there are many examples like that. If you think of like Blackstone Block in Boston, it's an intersection, and these other fragments of historic urbanism that are really, the tiny moments on pieces of land that fit in your backyard and are 2.5 stories, 3 stories of brick that you and the guys next to you could build in a couple years.
And without those moments, how do you navigate the homogeny? You look at watercolor or water sound, they're all done very well, but there's such an element of sameness as you move through it. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to do some pocket neighborhoods in Carlton Landing. The borough is, you're exactly right. I wouldn't want to see borough micro villages against each other everywhere. Then it would lose its significance. But within the context of a given design motif that can become very homogenized, it's nice to have these super interesting areas just to help you move through them with some sense of where you are,
Absolutely. And just one last point with that inner block and the fact that, as you just pointed out, it does fit at that scale inside of the block. Think about, there are a couple of tourist attractions, let's say in Bremen. There's the city hall, there's the market plots, there's these different things. And let's think about new urbanist developments around the main square, around the main, marketplace, whatever that is, 5 stories. They're dealing with the parking and everything that they have to deal with. You can build something that is as attractive or more attractive. It's different. I don't really mean to say that they're comparable. That's why I kind of use the Apple Store thing. But you can build something that's defining space, forming human-scaled space with traditional architecture that is beautiful, that will be just as much an anchor urbanism as, you know, the thing that they spent 10 times as much money on.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, we're looking forward to your upcoming presentation in Carlton Landing as well. So that's a really wonderful thing you're moving towards.
Yeah, looking forward to being there.
Mhm.
I would completely agree about the idea of proximate parking, and I put this in the chat. I mean, like, I live in downtown Pittsburgh. My condo does not have parking in any way attached to it. I walk 2 blocks to where I park my car, and that does not bother me in the least. I think that that is something that I absolutely agree that it's something that is slower to change, but I do think it is and will change. And I think it'll change in a variety of different ways. I think there'll be some things like, maybe, you know, you have a little pocket neighborhood and the parking for it is a permeable paver, neat little square that has trees in it half the time, that is, you know, half a block in distance away. And it may be as much as there is groupings of parking further away, and everything within the neighborhood you get to on golf cart or bike or whatever. But the actual where the car is may not be as much of a question of immediate proximity as much as ease of connectivity via foot, bike, or other alternate mode of transportation.
Ashley, that's such a great point. And I want to follow up by just saying, my wife and I just moved to a new historic townhouse. But for the last 2 years, we've lived in a small townhouse as part of a little cottage court thing, you know, surrounded by little townhouse. And we could afford to live there because we didn't have proximate parking. And so I think that allowing for or thinking about parking that's a little bit further away and the kind of you know, difficulties that causes does allow for more affordable housing. Because if my house, if the place where I lived had parking right next to it, I wouldn't have been able to afford it. So I was grateful for the fact that I walked, you know, a block sometimes, you know, if that's where I had to find my on-street parking, because of that, I could afford the place where I was living.
Hey, Thomas, this is Nathan. Leslie just wanted to let you know that she wasn't trying to be rude. She had a technical difficulty that caused her to actually not only get off of this, but she actually thought the whole meeting crashed. So she's at least happy now to hear that we kept moving forward. Does anybody else have any other questions?
Thomas, this is Jeffrey Mowen. I just want to say I appreciate your whole presentation. It's fantastic. And I'm actually working on a project that you've inspired me with several of your images and ideas that I can incorporate. And I actually think that a whole series of little hamlets stitched together could actually be quite incredible. You know, the Poundbury example.
Yeah.
The combination of multiple small European villages connected together. So I don't think you can get too much of this stuff. I think we could build on the less cars, not no cars idea, and continue to develop. And I just want to thank you. It's been inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything to say? By the way, Jeffrey, you know, in your backyard, they do have that one place that has different European villages in close proximity that Disney had a thought about.
Yeah, I do. I know it quite well.
Yeah.
It's not quite as intimate as those, though, so I appreciate it.
All right. Any other questions? If not, Thomas, thanks again for putting this together. It's obviously, you know, a testament to years of research and work, and we look forward to the further evolution of it. So thanks again. And Leslie will let everybody know about the next Guild event in the very near future. Talk to y'all later.
Thanks, Nathan.
Okay, bye.